Lance Morrow is an author, a writer, and an essayist. He joined Time magazine in 1965. During his time there, Morrow covered the Detroit riots, the Vietnam War, the Nixon administration, and the Watergate scandal. In 1976, he became a regular writer of essays for Time magazine. Also wrote more Man of the Year cover articles than any other reporter. From 1996 to 2006, he was a professor at Boston University. His several books include Evil and Investigation, God and Mammon, published in March of 2021, and his latest, The Noise of Typewriters, to be issued in January of 2023. Lance Morrow, you are not but a couple years older than I am, and when you get to be this age, you start thinking about your life and how long you're going to be around. How do you approach it? Because you went through some bad times with your heart attacks years ago. What do you think of being older or old age?
I'm actually amazed by it because I did have some serious heart trouble, which thankfully the technology of heart repair and so on has sort of kept up with my situation. So I've been doing actually quite well. When I write, a lot of the columns that I write now for the Wall Street Journal and for City Journal, I make a special effort to bring in the history that I remember from when I was young, which is, in the 50s and 60s and so on. And I do that very deliberately because I think there's a lack of historical perspective in a lot of the commentary that is going on now, for the very good reason that we are in a different age now, technologically and politically and in all sorts of ways. And yet the connections to the past and the patterns of the past seem to me to be extremely important. And it seems to me that ignorance of precedents and the earlier history of the country and so on is dangerous, not only damaging, but dangerous. So anyway, that's a grandiose way of saying that I do try to take advantage of the fact that I'm old and that I remember a lot. I have a very good memory for things that happened a long time ago. My parents were both journalists, and so I was kind of aware through them of various aspects of public life and American politics and so on. And I grew up in Washington, D.C. So I try to take advantage of I'm thinking of Reagan's crack when he was running against Mondale in 1984, and he said, "I'm not going to take advantage of my opponent's youth and inexperience." So I'm simply trying to take advantage of my age in the way that I write these things.
It says when you go to Amazon looking at your books and all that, there's a one coming out in 2023 called The Noise of Typewriters. Have you finished that?
Yeah. I'm copy reading it. It's being copyrighted now, and so we're just closing it up.
Don't want to go too far ahead on it, but what's it about, and what's been your experience writing this particular book?
Well, it's a series of essays. Really, it's a long essay, like that book called God and Mammon that you mentioned a moment ago. It's kind of a long essay. It's actually a rather short book, but I'm interested in the way that journalism affected public life in the 20th century. This is about basically 20th century journalism and certain aspects of 20th century journalism, and how the way that journalism performed touched and actually changed history during that time. For example, the famous case of Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow in 1932, who won a Pulitzer Prize for international reporting with a series of essays of reports on Stalin, praising Stalin extravagantly, just at the moment when Stalin was starving to death. Some 7 or 8 million Ukrainians and people in the North Caucasus and so on, because they were resisting his plan to collectivize the farms. And Duranty's reports in the New York Times not only won the Pulitzer, but they got the attention of Franklin Roosevelt, and he decided to recognize the Soviet Union, which had long been a goal of the Soviets and was an important thing. He recognized the Soviet Union very much influenced by Duranty and his articles, and that was one instance of the way in which the performance of journalism touched history, altered it. You could look at I also look at the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive, for example, in 1968, early 68, when the media construed the communists' Tet Offensive as a great communist victory, as a great North Vietnamese victory, but in actual military fact, it was a defeat for General Giap and Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese communists. But it was an immense psychological victory for them, for the communists, because it broke the back of the American will to fight the war. And from February 68 on, Americans really gave up. It was the beginning of their giving up on Vietnam. And so that was another way in which the performance of journalism altered or certainly seriously affected the course of history. So it's pieces like that, but it's also quite personal. I tell a lot of private stories and personal stories because, as I say, both my parents were journalists, and it was kind of a family trade. And because of them, I grew up regarding history as a sort of small town. There was, in other words, the doings of presidents. They were always, coming home to dinner and talking about Harry Truman, whom they knew very well and who called my father by his first name, and they talked about they had dinner with Richard Nixon sometimes when he was a congressman, and so there was a sense of I grew up with a sort of sense of that these big public figures were actually personal relations in some way. And anyway, that's roughly what the book is about.
As I was thinking about this conversation, I wrote down a list of things that happened in both of our lives and wanted to go over them very quickly and then get your reaction to it. President Johnson left office because of the Vietnam War after one term. President Nixon resigned before he got impeached and convicted and sent out by the Congress. President Clinton was impeached but not convicted. President Trump was impeached twice and not convicted. Vice President Agnew had to leave office because he was a crook.
Right.
Jim Wright resigned because he was accused of ethics violations back in 1989. Newt Gingrich resigned as Speaker and left Congress because of an ethics charge. Bob Livingston, who was chosen by the Republicans to be the successor to Newt Gingrich, had to announce in the Congress that he had had affairs and would step back. President John Kennedy has since he was assassinated, has been written about many times as being a womanizer and having affairs with an 18-year-old. I could go on, and then there's Dennis Hastert, who went to prison for sexually abusing high school kids. The point I'm mentioning all this is this an unusual period in history?
You mean the period starting with, say, Jack Kennedy up to the present?
Yeah, all these people I've mentioned having to resign and you be impeached and all that.
Well, it seems to me that that one factor that you have to bear in mind is that the manners, if you will, of the journalists have changed immensely since the 60s. And what was not mentioned about presidents and public figures before became the object of investigation, not only curiosity, but investigations and very urgent, intrusive investigations. I'm thinking of the obvious case of Franklin Roosevelt's, not only his romance with Lucy Mercer, but also the very fact of his being crippled by polio, and the fact that the White House press corps was very protective of that fact, of the fact of his having wearing these braces on and not being able to walk in any normal way. And the White House photographers actually declined to photograph him when he was being lifted into a car, for example. And there were one or two cases where they destroyed. The guy took a picture and they took the plate out of the old speed graphic camera and actually exposed the plate and destroyed it. But that's not quite responsive to your question. It seems to me that if you look back in American political history, you can find all the scandal you care to look for, starting, I suppose you could go back to Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, and talk about, there were many, there were reports in the press at that time talking about Dusky Sally and all of that, and about his having a mistress who was also his slave. And you could go up through Grover Cleveland and Warren Harding, and if you're looking for the sexual stories, and there were any number of, especially in the Harding administration, cases of financial misdeeds, and in the Ulysses Grant's administration, although he himself was personally honest, he had very bad judgment about some of the people that he trusted, and there were that sort of scandal. So I think it would be hard to say that the period that you talked about is more scandalous than others, but it certainly is the case that journalism itself, the rules of journalism and the manners and protocols of journalism have surely changed a very great deal. That anything and everything becomes fair game in a president's conduct or any politician's conduct. So, a figure like Trump is sort of unusual, to say the least. He's unique, I would say. But I don't know. What do you think? You went all through all this stuff the same as I did. I've always, my father was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer before he became an editor at the Saturday Evening Post, and later he became a very senior aide to Nelson Rockefeller, who of course had his own scandals. And as a matter of fact, my father was the guy who announced Rockefeller's death on the night that he died in that apartment on West 54th Street with the woman who was his mistress. And my father always had a very slightly amused sort of W.C. Fields attitude toward politicians and their behavior. He he had that H.L. Mencken sense of politicians as inherently probably being crooked and very likely being idiots, and to be amused by, sometimes anyway, not in a malicious way necessarily, but he didn't. He sort of assumed that kind of behavior. He thought that was part of the American scheme, and so he was. I never saw him shocked by this sort of behavior. I remember Estes Kefauver was a senator from Tennessee who became famous in the early 50s because he conducted some Senate hearings into crime, organized crime, and he became Adlai Stevenson's vice presidential running mate in 1956. And Kefauver's wife was a friend of my mother's, and so my mother knew a lot of inside stuff about him. And I mean, this is a guy running for vice president of the United States, and he got into some fantastic scrapes because of extremely heavy drinking and womanizing. And these things never saw the light of day, of print, that is. But there was a lot of that. I mean, Wilbur Mills, who was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee for many years, was a raging alcoholic. And he once, after he sobered up, he confessed that that he couldn't remember anything that had happened in the previous 8 years. This was a guy who signed off on every dollar that was spent by the federal government. So, I think anywhere you dropped your bucket in the historical sea, going back a couple hundred years, anywhere you dropped your bucket, you would come up with some interesting specimens of scandal and misbehavior.
I want to read from a recent column that you wrote that was published in the Wall Street Journal on June 24th and get you to expand on it. You say in a column that's headlined, "Could This Be an Antebellum Age?" You say the country's political manners are not what they were. To this, the progressives' cult of change replies, "So what?" And Donald Trump agrees. You cannot make an omelet without breaking eggs. There is truth in the thought. On the other hand, it is the favorite metaphor of monsters. The law itself, the principle of law, the authority of law, is sorely tested and feels as if it is being broken. When prosecutors refuse to prosecute real crimes, society is morally underwater. Tell us more.
Well, I think that I was thinking about the approach of July 4th and how people are feeling, and especially in the wake of the January 6th hearings. And I think it seems to me there is a sense that something in the law has been abandoned or broken. It I think partly is a result of the 2 years experience with the pandemic, but it also with the George Floyd death in Minneapolis, and then the subsequent summer in which there were so many violent protests, violent and otherwise, but a lot of videos of incredible violence and burning of police cars, burning of police stations, attacking the federal courthouse in Portland, and all of that. It seems to me that people have much less confidence now that the law is working properly and that it can be trusted. I think trust is a huge word always in politics, and the the level of trust is way, way down, I would say, in terms of the rule of law on either side. I mean, it's a pervasive. It's from left to right, and the villains are left or right, depending on where you yourself are located on the ideological spectrum. But it seems to me that the trust in the law itself is much diminished from what it was. And I think this is also a function of the fact that we seem to be getting very, very third-rate leadership on a lot of levels. Partly it's this gerontocracy. There are too many very old people in the positions of the greatest power, and I think that added to the fact that there's such a deep division politically between the left and the right, or whatever you want to call it, between the Trumpists and the otherwise, a divide that has only been dramatized by the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court. And incidentally, the Supreme Court itself is getting to be a very unfortunately an example of the lack of trust. The agitation, especially on the left, to delegitimize the court, especially because of Dobbs, but also because of the gun decision recently. That is an illustration, it seems to me, of the weakening of the civic morale and a weakening of the trust that people really need to have. Americans have always been at each other's throats, and we've always been a binary country, and that we, north and south and east and west and populist, the eastern seaboard and Jacksonians, and endlessly you can find these binaries. But it seems to me that in the 21st century, it comes into a new a dangerous stage, partly because of the social media and just the instantaneous nature of information, and I don't think that the United States is in a very good place at the moment. I can remember the 60s being pretty bad, but it seems to me that the current mood and the state of people's minds is not very healthy.
As I was reading some of the things you've written in the past and looking around the web and all for video, I found one on YouTube, and it actually turned out to be an interview that I did with you several years ago. But the odd thing was, they took our video. They took my questions out. And this is interesting. I want to get your reaction to it. This is for an organization called ASMR. It stands for Auto Sensory Meridian Response. And if you haven't seen it, you ought to look it up. And the reason is, and I'm not an expert on this, I haven't done a lot of deep research, but this outfit looks for people who are soothing, who they can listen to and be comfortable with. They clearly took my voice out because it's harsh, and they put the questions on the side. I mean, they didn't ask our permission to do this. They just did it. But you are one of those that they have used. I just wondered if you have often thought of yourself as soothing when you give a speech or talk.
Or soporific, maybe. That's the funniest thing I ever heard. I mean, what a world! You'd have a whole thing that would be devoted to the idea that you would address I mean, is this to put people to sleep or
It's to calm them, I think. I mean, there's
yeah.
there's millions of these things, I guess. But
That's amazing.
yeah.
Amazing.
Anyway, look it up. It's autosensory meridian response ASMR, and maybe we can talk more about it.
That's
sometime.
amazing. As a matter of fact, I mean, there is something in that. In the, if I may analyze my own soporific qualities, I have always tried, I think, whether consciously or unconsciously, for all these many years, is to try and understand, and not to telegraph my own strong political opinions, but rather to understand either side and to try and conciliate in some way if it's possible. And in other words, I think my natural temperament is against extreme. It's my natural tendency is to look at the other side, or to try and explore the other side or both sides. I remember in 1988, at the time of the first Intifada, Time magazine sent me to Israel and to the West Bank and Gaza, and I spent months over there sorting out. I wrote 2 cover stories for Time magazine, one on the Israeli 40th anniversary of the founding of Israel, and the other on the situation of the Palestinians. And I would go up to the West Bank or Gaza, and I would spend weeks listening to people and just taking down their life stories and so on. Then I would go into Israel and talk to all kinds of people and listen to their life stories. And I understood, I think, the point of view of either side pretty thoroughly. In other words, I could put myself in the position of, but every time I left Lod Airport and flew back to New York, I would be relieved of a tremendous headache, because the effort to reconcile these 2 different universes in that one small place of Israel and the West Bank gave you a splitting head. I mean, it was very, very hard, and I'm beginning to feel that way about this country.
Let's go back to your early years when you were a page in the United States Senate. What do you remember from those times?
Well, it was 1953. It was just the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. I had a summer job as a Senate page boy, because a senator from Michigan named Potter had a page who had asthma, so he had to go home in the summertime. He couldn't stand Washington summers, but so I filled in with him for him for a couple of months in the Senate. It was a remarkable Senate. Richard Nixon was in the presiding officer's chair as vice president. Very young and skinny John Kennedy was there. Joe McCarthy was in full cry. Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin and his crusade. Lyndon Johnson was the minority leader, and I did a lot of running of errands for him. Everett Dirksen, William Nolan, Hubert Humphrey, who was an extremely nice guy, by the way. He was very nice to the pages and kind of helped us out. I was very young. I was actually underage, but I was 12 years old, but they kind of slipped me in. But the working in that, I absolutely I did it for 2 summers, and I loved it. I was fascinated by it, fascinated by the people. Being in that situation and up close to these people, and having a sense of the way that the Senate operated, and having a sense of their personalities, gave me a feeling that I mentioned earlier, that history was sort of a small town, and indeed Washington in those days was kind of a small town. And I used to play touch football with Bobby Kennedy over in Georgetown at the Georgetown playground on 34th Q. And on that same playground, I would play softball with Scoop Jackson of Washington State. But it was that Senate thing gave me a sense of awe about the whole business, but also seeing them so up close and so on. Also disabused me of. It's funny. I had both a feeling of great characters and yet of very fallible, very mortal type, ordinary characters. I remember one day that Kennedy had been out because he'd had an operation on his back, and he showed up at the back of the Senate, the double doors that opened at the top of the center aisle. And it was a Saturday morning, and there were some senators there, and some people in the gallery, but this skinny guy in a suit that didn't quite fit him and so on, with the big thatch of hair, came in the doors and stood there leaning on his crutches, and every eye in the place went to him. And he had some star quality that was very interesting, and I had no particular reason to know that he was a great celebrity, but there was something in that moment that was arresting. And I remember one day through those same doors came this apple-cheeked little old guy with white hair and bristling eyebrows, and it was Herbert Hoover. And Eisenhower had come in, and so the Republicans were back in power, and Herbert Hoover could show his face again in Washington, and he came to visit the Senate. And so we all lined up and shook hands with him, which I've always thought was funny, that I can say that I shook hands with Herbert Hoover, which puts me back degrees of separation, puts me quite a ways back.
What do you think the reaction of young people today in the Senate would be compared to when you were there? I mean, you teach. I mean, you taught for a long time, so you had young people in your classroom at Boston University, and I'd be interested in your reaction to what they were interested in, what their attitude is about everything today. I suspect that it's not too different now, although I don't know. That's an interesting question. I suspect that the dynamic as between the private and the public, I've always been interested in that relationship between the private world and the public world, between private character or that is, say, character and policy, for example. I've always thought that was fascinating. And when you're as young as I was, and you're very impressionable, and you remember everything, you remember every little detail of every day, and to see Lyndon Johnson, for example, in action as he was then. My boss was a guy named Bobby Baker, whom you and I remember, but some people won't. But he was a young protege of Lyndon Johnson, who later got into all sorts of trouble for shady dealings. But Bobby was to watch Bobby operating and to watch Lyndon Johnson operating, and the body English, for example, the way that Johnson would put his big hands on a guy's shoulder and sort of massage the man's shoulder as he was talking to him. He'd get right into his face, and he was giving him it's the strangest thing. He was giving him a body massage on the back of his neck and the back of his shoulders as he was persuading him, as he was
working him, and trying to get him to change his vote or whatever the purpose was. But it was very interesting to see that, and I suspect that today that probably would not have changed. I imagine that pages and interns at the White House and so on would have something of the same reaction. I had a real reverence for the Senate. I mean, I developed a real awe which is one reason I reacted very strongly against the January 6th thing, because it looked to me like a desecration that was intolerable. But I suspect that young people today would probably feel something along the same line. It's hard to say.
Speaking of January the 6th, this just happened, and by the time people hear this, it will be the way things travel so fast, it'd be history. What was your reaction, if any, to General Michael Flynn when they asked him the question in the January 6th hearings, in the research part of it? Do you believe in the peaceful transfer of power? And he took the fifth.
Well, yeah. I
mean, what is this all about?
Well, I have the same reaction that who was it recently who I'm forgetting, but was asked to define, can you tell me what a woman is? And said no. It was in a congressional hearing. But I was not listening or watching when Flynn did that. But it's just astonishing. It's just this is part of what I was talking about earlier. Just the talking about trust and there's. I wish there were a reset button. This is a sort of, we've been here before, of course, but it really is difficult and sort of appalling.
You've supposedly, you can confirm this, written over 150 articles in Time magazine, cover stories, and as you look back on it, I don't want to ask you what your favorite was, but I would like to ask you, what were a couple of cover stories or long articles you wrote that you think had the biggest reaction?
My first cover story for Time was about I went to work for Time in 1965, and they put me to work doing the people section, which I hated, the back page and gossip items. But then I wrote national news, and my first cover story for Time was the 1967 riots in Detroit. There were many riots in those days. There were many protests and uprisings or whatever one calls them now, but I wrote about the Detroit situation. I'm trying to think. There are so many of them. I actually did not greatly enjoy writing Time cover stories. I wrote well over 150 of them, and including a lot of their Man of the Year, as they were called then, Man of the Year cover stories. And the reason I didn't like doing them very much was that they tended to be a little bit formulaic, and or more than a little. They had a certain way of running, and it was hard to break out of that mold. When Time started its essay page, Henry Grunwald was the managing editor, and he started that page partly for my sake, so that I could, have a. And when that happened, it became possible over a period of time to write in a much more individual way. But Time had for years had its own formulas and its own style, once fairly notorious. I mean, you'll recall at least the in 1936 when Wolcott Gibbs of the New Yorker wrote that famous parody, which is still brilliant, of Time magazine, of backwards run sentences till reels the mind, talking about all the Time mannerisms and pretensions and so on. Anyway, I didn't greatly enjoy writing the cover stories. There was one instance when my wife, Susan Bryn Morrow, who's a writer herself, was over in Egypt, and she's an expert on Egypt and hieroglyphs and things like that. And she called me and said, this was it was 30 years ago. She told me that Mount Sinai, which she knew very well, and she knew the monks at St. Catherine's Monastery there, that Mount Sinai was in danger because they were building cable cars, and they wanted to turn it into a sort of tourist trap. And so I wrote an essay immediately for Time, which, amazingly enough, Time immediately printed, mocking this idea of cable cars on Mount Sinai, of all places, and turning a spot as august as Mount Sinai into a tourist trap. And by God, within a couple of days, they abandoned the project, and they said, we never intended to do that, and in fact, we're going to stop doing it. And that I think was probably the most immediately effective thing I ever wrote for Time. It got results right away.
What's the difference between Time magazine when you were there and today?
Oh, Time is vastly different from. I came in. I really had the best of it from 65 through 2005. I'm talking about 40 years, and it had started out under Luce. Time was very. There were no bylines, for example. The bylines came in the early 70s, and that was a big step. The difference between Time today and Time then is so vast as to be difficult to describe. That what happened was that, I mean, the Time magazine under Henry Luce, and for some time afterward, he died he resigned in 64 and he died in 67. Time under Luce had a tremendous amount of money. It was the golden age of magazines, and Time was rolling in dough, and they could afford to do things up in a big way. They had bureaus all over the world. They spent a lot of money on every bureau. The Time bureau chief was a kind of ambassador in Rome or in Cairo or in Bangkok or wherever. The Time bureau chief was almost a personage. He was a minor personage, and could talk to anybody. Time. It's difficult to get people today to understand how important magazines were in that era, before all the media that we know now, the electronics and so on. But magazines were tremendously important, and Time was right up there in the top tier, half dozen or so. And Time had tremendous influence, I believe, on the American middle class. There was a guy named Hutchins who had been the chancellor at the University of Chicago, and he claimed that Time magazine had more impact on the American mind than the entire American system of public education. And it sounds like an exaggeration, but there's something to it. It really was very important. So a huge difference between then and now is that Time had a lot of money, and it was very influential. and its opinions mattered. And today, Time is another magazine among many magazines. It does some things very well. I haven't seen it for a little while, but it does some things quite well, and it's got some fine writers on it and so on. But it's an entirely different dynamic in its relationship between the magazine and the readership, because the entire framework of communications and media has so profoundly altered with the coming of the electronics and everything that they have brought with them.
If you had to make a list of 5 of the most powerful media institutions today, what would you put on that list?
Today, well, I think you'd have to put the New York Times, which of course is much changed from what it used to be. I would have to. I think certainly Facebook, just as a aggregator and distributor of info. The Twitter is certainly. I don't know if that's what you're talking about. But anyway, I'll just. Twitter is enormously important because of the speed and the enormous size of the enormous number of people that can be reached very rapidly. I had dinner with Britt Hume a couple of months ago, and he was talking about Twitter, and he said that he spends a lot of time every day on Twitter because he regards it as so important. Which is, I'm not on Twitter, and I can't really. I don't have a good feeling for it, but it seems to me that the what you might call the metaphysics of information and journalism got to be changed very significantly by the nature of Twitter, by the speed, the efficiency of with which it reaches all kinds of different people in different categories. So I would certainly list Twitter. I'm not very good at communications today. I feel as if that's an area in which my age is probably a factor, because it's not my immediate thing. I think the Wall Street Journal does a very good job at what it does, and I've been very happy to be doing pieces there.
When you were teaching at Boston University, what subject did you teach?
Well, I was teaching the essay, a course that I enjoyed very much, and I was teaching presidential history, the press and the presidency, the relations between the press and the presidency, and I was mainly just telling them stories and talking about the themes that I cover in my journalism, is how journalism would touch history in one way or another.
So what did your students at the time use as their number one way of staying up with the news?
It was a sort of transition time. I left there 15 years ago, and it was before the onset of the full. It was before iPhones, I guess, but anyway, it was before the onset of the full social media. People switching over to pure electronics. So they were. I was trying to get them to read the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on. They were. It was a very much a patchwork of stuff. As to tell you the truth, I think they got most of their information from Jon Stewart's comedy TV show. I remember that when Stewart was, and he did, his themes were very political, and they took their politics and their information a lot from that. Now that I think of it, I believe that they got an awful lot of their information or pseudo-information or opinions from entertainment rather than from what we would have called journalism.
So we'll wrap this up, but I want to ask you about the essay. What is an essayist?
I think the essay is the most wonderful form because you can do anything with it. You can go anywhere with it. I used to tell my students that an essay is the adventures of an idea in the mind of the writer. And if an essay is done honestly, you say, what if this, and so on. It's a way of arguing with yourself. It's different from a column, a newspaper column, because a newspaper column has a tendency to want to make a specific point. An essay seems to me is a little more civilized in that it is not leaping to a conclusion, but rather it's a way of thinking through something. And I believe that every essay has its own form. Every idea for an essay takes the form that it needs to take if it's done well. And so I think it's a wonderful, extremely adaptable, very useful form, and I think that that an essay is of course can be anything. Shakespeare's soliloquies are all essays. They're very tightly machined essays. Moby Dick is essentially a series of essays that is held together by a melodrama of this crazy guy looking for a white whale. But the bulk of Moby Dick is the series of essays on whaling and the whiteness of the whale and all of that. And I think an essay can be almost anything, but I think it's a wonderful form, and it gets you in a little trouble where journalism is concerned, of course, because essays tend to be personal or maybe personal anyway, and opinionated, and journalism, as we still, I think, are trying for some sense of objectivity and just the facts and all of that. That's always a struggle That's a whole other subject, of course.
Next year, Lance Morrow's next book will be The Noise of Typewriters. Those of you who haven't read some of the other books, one of them's called Evil, an Investigation. One of them's called God and Mammon, Chronicles of American Money. And then there's, years ago, The Best Year of Their Lives, Kennedy, Nixon, and Johnson in 1948, Learning the Secrets of Power. Lance Morrow, thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.